The man stepped off the 1117 train at Vienna's Westbahnhof, wearing a dull olive-green uniform that matched 1,000 others. His stride was precise, his face blank. He carried no luggage, just a briefcase. Aged but unremarkable, its steel hinges dull from wear. No one noticed him. Not the tourists milling by the cafe, not the Austrian police stationed under the arch, not even the Western agent pretending to read a newspaper 2 benches away. But inside that briefcase were the coordinates of 14 nuclear launch facilities, detailed schematics of Soviet SIGINT centers, and the latest cipher protocols used by KGB field stations across Eastern Europe, all copied by hand, all smuggled out under the nose of the most feared security apparatus on Earth. At exactly 11:28, the man crossed the square and paused near a construction sign. He lit a cigarette, removed a torn sheet from a Russian novel, and left it tucked behind a pipe. Then he walked away, never once looking back. 72 hours later, the CIA's Berlin station decoded the message embedded in that scrap of literature. The data was verified, cross-referenced, and disseminated to Langley within a day. It wasn't just actionable, it was staggering. The information confirmed what U.S. analysts had long suspected: there was a leak inside the heart of Soviet intelligence. But not just any leak. This one had been running for over a year, undetected, silent, surgical, and deliberate, back in Moscow. The reaction was immediate but silent. No alarms, no raids, just a series of calls, made quietly, to men in windowless rooms. Those who answered found themselves faced with a single terrifying question: who is giving the Americans our soul? Inside the walls of the Lubyanka, panic didn't come with shouting. It came with silence. Elevators locked, files vanished, trusted officers reassigned without notice. A memo labeled Crimson Rain circulated among the inner circle, its contents classified, even from department heads. But the subtext was clear. Someone had opened the gates, and no one could figure out who or why. It was the kind of betrayal the KGB's own doctrine said couldn't happen. Loyalty was everything. Surveillance was total. And yet, somewhere, a trusted Soviet officer had made a choice. Not to defect, not to run, but to stay and bleed the state from within, inside the Second Chief Directorate of the KGB, which oversaw internal security and counterintelligence. Confidence was not just routine, it was doctrine. Every corridor of the Lubyanka was steeped in an air of absolute control. Officers whispered about NATO agents and CIA trickery, but no one truly believed that a mole could exist among them. Not at that level, not in Moscow. The assumptions were etched into concrete. First, no Soviet officer with access to top-secret material would ever betray the motherland without defecting. Treason, in their view, always came with a dramatic exit, a dash across a border, a hijacked plane, a desperate call to the embassy. The idea that someone might stay behind smiling, saluting, attending briefings while feeding information to the enemy was dismissed as Western fantasy. Second, surveillance was infallible. Every employee with access to compartmented material was monitored, their family histories checked, their phone calls recorded, their movements tracked by internal security. The very notion of a breach in Moscow Center itself, a leak operating in the heart of the KGB, was seen as impossible. And third, ideology was the ultimate firewall. Every officer was indoctrinated, selected, and tested not just for competence but for belief. Patriotism was currency. To betray the system was to betray the very foundation of their identity. No loyal son of the Soviet Union would hand over secrets to the Americans, not unless he was mad. But the cracks were already forming. Unexplained American precision strikes on Soviet-aligned outposts. U.S. negotiators arriving at arms talks with knowledge of installations the KGB hadn't even finished building. A sudden wave of roll-ups of KGB operations in Western Europe, some terminated just days before launch. The signs were subtle, but accumulating. Still, the response was denial. One internal memo called the pattern coincidental clustering. Another blamed improved satellite resolution. A third pointed to possible East German security failures. Never not once did the Second Directorate seriously consider the truth that the enemy was not across the ocean. The enemy was across the hallway, and even as classified data continued to vanish handwritten, copied from memory, or smuggled on microfilm, KGB command doubled down on their certainty. The Americans must be guessing. The Americans must be bluffing. The Americans must be reading our signals. They were wrong on every count. Because the Americans weren't listening to signals. They were listening to a man. A quiet, meticulous officer, buried deep in the system, who knew exactly what his superiors refused to believe, that loyalty can be a mask. And sometimes, the most trusted man in the room is the one holding the knife. The Soviet intelligence empire was built on one iron principle: control through compartmentalization. No one officer knew too much. No one department had the full picture. Every file, every mission, every directive passed through layers of bureaucracy designed to prevent exactly what the West had managed during World War II: total code penetration. After the devastation of the German invasion in 1941, the KGB's predecessors had vowed never again to be caught off guard. The doctrine that emerged in the 1950s and calcified through the 1960s was brutally elegant. It ensured that no Western agency could ever outmaneuver the Soviet machine, not by infiltration, not by subversion, and certainly not by charm. But this system had a weakness. It had never been tested against someone who didn't want to run. The KGB expected defectors to be dramatic, impulsive, reckless. Their surveillance and countermeasures were tuned to catch sudden shifts: a man buying a one-way train ticket, skipping routine reports, failing a loyalty check. The entire doctrine depended on visible friction that a traitor would leave fingerprints, behave erratically, or trigger one of the hundreds of fail-safes scattered across the internal network. But the man who was bleeding them dry did none of those things. He followed protocol, he passed loyalty checks, he toasted the general secretary at banquets, and memorized party slogans with machine-like precision. He was so precise, so boring, so invisible that the system labeled him as sterile, a term reserved for officers too dull to watch closely. And that was his weapon. He didn't steal files. He transcribed them. By hand, he didn't hoard data. He passed it off in small fragments, each one meaningless in isolation but devastating in sequence. A train schedule here, a promotion list there, a minor policy revision. Each drop was a single thread, and the Americans were weaving a net. The doctrine had no protocol for this, no handbook for the quiet traitor who stayed in place, the man who used compliance as camouflage. Soviet intelligence couldn't see him because they were looking for the wrong kind of enemy, someone angry, greedy, loud. But this man wasn't angry. He wasn't greedy. And he wasn't loud. He was methodical. The Americans understood something the KGB had never imagined: that true betrayal didn't always come from weakness. Sometimes it came from cold, calculated belief. And the doctrine, so reliant on detecting deviations, was about to face its greatest flaw. It could not detect discipline. Berlin, 1979. A manila envelope lands on the desk of a CIA analyst stationed at the newly upgraded Berlin operating base. The source, a known Soviet courier drop, previously used to smuggle low-value diplomatic chatter. What's inside, however, is anything but low-value blueprints. Not just any blueprints, interior schematics of a KGB electronic listening post in Czechoslovakia, including personnel rotations, antenna arrays, and frequency logs. At first, the analyst thinks it's a plant, disinformation, but the level of detail is too surgical. The handwriting matches previous samples from a source they had codenamed Cassius. Langley confirms these are internal Soviet documents, never before intercepted, seen only by senior KGB infrastructure officers. An alarm is triggered not in Moscow, but in Virginia. Because if these plans are real, it means two things. First, the CIA has an active source inside Moscow Center itself. And second, the KGB has no idea. Cassius, they now realize, has penetrated a level of access no American human asset has ever reached. Within days, follow-up drops yield more intercepted telexes from KGB residenturas across Eastern Europe, dossiers on double agents planted in Warsaw, surveillance protocols for dissidents in Prague. It's not a leak, it's a hemorrhage. Back in Moscow, a KGB major stares at a decrypted American broadcast intercepted by a listening post near Tallinn. It contains veiled references to Eastern listening assets' code language the Soviets recognize as a signal someone knows too much. But instead of triggering an alert, it's buried. Another coincidence. They think, another bluff. They are wrong. The impossible continues. In January 1980, NATO suddenly reroutes a major training exercise after weather complications. But Soviet intelligence watches with disbelief as the new route completely bypasses their freshly constructed radar coverage in East Germany coverage, whose existence is known only to 4 officers in Moscow. That same month, a missile storage facility under construction in Belarus experiences unexplained logistical delays because a nearby U.S. recon satellite appears to be hovering overhead for hours at a time. Soviet engineers suspect coincidence. Their superiors suspect sabotage. No one suspects what's really happening. The Americans are being told exactly what to look for by a man sitting calmly in an office in Moscow, wearing a uniform, filing reports, and copying everything by hand. He's not hiding in shadows. He's hiding in plain sight. And each impossible event, the schematics, the telexes, the radar reroute isn't just a victory for the CIA. It's a rehearsal, a test of just how much this one man can feed them without triggering Soviet alarms. So far, he's passed every test, and the next drop will be his most devastating yet, inside the Kremlin's most secretive offices. Quiet panic was beginning to seep beneath the surface, not in the form of shouting, or arrests, or public disgrace, but in silences that lasted just a few seconds too long, in files that disappeared from circulation without explanation, in officers reassigned suddenly, without farewells. The Americans knew too much, too fast, too precisely. But when internal inquiries began, they started from the wrong premise that Soviet security had not been compromised. At first, senior GRU officials blamed their East German counterparts. The Stasi had been running point on several cross-border operations that had collapsed mysteriously in recent months. Perhaps it was their tradecraft that had failed. Perhaps they were too lax, too proud, too isolated. It was a comfortable theory blaming a junior partner. Next came suspicion of NATO's electronic surveillance. Western satellites had improved dramatically, especially in real-time photo resolution. A task force was assembled to study whether low-orbit platforms were being used to triangulate truck convoys and site construction schedules. Internal reports confirmed that, yes, this surveillance existed, but it couldn't explain the precision with which the Americans were now operating. A chilling memo from the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate warned, if this pattern of foreknowledge continues, we must assume an ongoing internal breach. However, there is no evidence of such a breach. They simply couldn't accept it. The doctrine wouldn't allow it. Within the KGB, the very idea that an officer could be turned and continue to operate undetected inside Moscow Center was heretical. It would mean that the entire edifice of loyalty screenings, behavioral audits, and surveillance protocols had failed. It would mean the system had been blind. So they looked outward, blamed others, imagined technical wizardry. One theory suggested that the CIA had developed a new acoustic satellite that could listen to military construction sites. Another posited a massive human network embedded in Warsaw Pact infrastructure personnel. Others whispered about betrayal inside the Politburo men, like Andropov and Gromyko, feeding Western analysts for their own political gain. But none of these theories accounted for the details the Americans were receiving. Details that only someone in the KGB's own planning section could have known. Still, no one dared voice it aloud. To accuse a fellow officer without hard proof was career suicide. To suggest a mole at the center was to indict the entire doctrine. So instead, they papered over the leaks with audits, memos, and warnings, and behind the scenes, the man responsible for it all kept walking into his office, unquestioned, unnoticed, untouched. The Americans weren't just receiving secrets, they were receiving them from a source whose very existence Soviet leaders refused to believe. Desperation breeds delusion. And by mid-1980, Soviet counterintelligence had embraced a new explanation for the impossible. The leaks weren't real. They were disinformation planted by the Americans, designed to manipulate Soviet response patterns. It was a convenient theory. Clever, even. If the CIA had fabricated documents and slipped them into known KGB collection routes, it would explain why Langley appeared to know so much while preserving the illusion that the KGB's inner sanctum remained unbreached. This hypothesis gained traction quickly. A task force under the Second Chief Directorate drafted a 38-page report titled Operation Smokescreen, which argued that the real American goal was to sow distrust inside Soviet leadership. If they could convince Moscow that someone high up had betrayed them, they could paralyze Soviet intelligence operations from within without lifting a finger. For weeks, the Kremlin bought it. Officers breathed easier. Some restrictions on internal travel were lifted. A few key figures reassigned during the earlier panic were quietly reinstated. Surveillance protocols were relaxed. The mole hunt was shelved. Confidence, though cracked, began to reassert itself. But outside of Moscow, the consequences of this theory were devastating. Operations in Western Europe continued to fail. Courier lines were compromised. Cipher protocols revised just months earlier were being cracked within days. One particularly damning incident involved a Soviet agent embedded in Brussels who was captured less than 24 hours after transmitting his first message. The Belgians had received a full dossier on him typed, translated, and annotated 3 days prior. Still, KGB analysts clung to the disinformation narrative. They told themselves the Americans had backfilled this data after the arrest, that NATO had merely guessed, gotten lucky, or was playing their own long game. Anything but the truth. Someone in Moscow was feeding the West real, raw, first-tier intelligence, and he was doing it with surgical precision. The mole, still operating undetected, watched the Soviet reaction with cold amusement. Every time they dismissed a leak as planted, he grew bolder. Every false theory gave him more time. He fed the CIA more targeting data, more personnel logs, more encryption schedules. Each drop was clean, each drop was verified, and each one slipped through the cracks of Soviet certainty. They had the wrong theory, they had the wrong suspect list, and they were hunting in the wrong places. The KGB, so proud of its analytical prowess, had been outthought, outpaced, and outmaneuvered by one man with a notepad, a flawless memory, and a cause he believed was greater than fear. And while they hunted shadows, he prepared his next dispatch. The Americans weren't just lucky, they were being guided. When the disinformation theory began to crumble under the weight of continued intelligence losses, Soviet leadership needed a new explanation, one that didn't implicate Moscow directly, but still accounted for the Americans' uncanny precision. They found their answer in technology, Theory 2 satellite interception. The logic seemed sound. The CIA, they believed, had developed an advanced orbital system capable of intercepting microwave transmissions between Soviet command centers and military outposts. Perhaps these satellites, armed with ultra-sensitive antennas, were hovering just long enough to scoop up encrypted bursts, which the Americans then decrypted using brute force computing. This theory was seductive. It played to Soviet fears of American technological superiority, particularly in microelectronics, and most importantly, it absolved their internal systems of failure. If the Americans were eavesdropping from orbit, it wasn't betrayal, it was espionage, and espionage could be countered. A sweeping countermeasure program was launched under the codename Zasslon, meaning barrier. Secure lines were rerouted. Microwave relay towers were physically shielded. Redundant analog backups were reintroduced across command centers in Belarus, Poland, and the Baltics. Military communications reverted to hand-delivered transcripts in critical zones. It was a massive operation, costing millions of rubles and thousands of man-hours, and it accomplished nothing because the Americans weren't intercepting signals. They were reading typed transcripts, delivered via dead drops, microfilm, and encoded notes handwritten by a man who sat less than 100 meters from the very office ordering the Zasslon countermeasures. Still, the Soviet generals praised the new protocol. One even boasted during a closed briefing, "Zasslon is a technological iron curtain. Let the Americans try now." Within a week, the CIA received an exact copy of that quote, because the mole had been in the room. And while Soviet engineers scrambled to retrofit bunkers and jam frequencies, he was busy copying encryption keylogs and agent rosters. Not because he was being reckless, but because the new theory, like the first, gave him more time. Zasslon focused all suspicion upward toward the sky, toward space, toward radio waves and satellites. And while Soviet radar stations tracked every U.S. launch, while analysts reviewed heat signatures and antenna vectors, the real breach sat below, behind a desk, dutifully logging his attendance and never missing a morning report. In fact, Zasslon made his job easier. Messages were now more often carried by hand, bundled into folders, circulated via human courier rather than digital line, and that meant more documents, more signatures, more access. Soviet command was tightening its defenses around a phantom, and the man they were trying to stop had already mapped their next war game exercise. The wrong theory wasn't just ineffective, it was fuel. And while Moscow looked to the skies, the real fire burned beneath their feet. In the annals of Cold War espionage, few failures would cut as deep or last as long as the Soviet inability to unmask the quiet traitor bleeding their secrets to the West. The CIA had codenamed him TRIDENT. To the Soviets, he had no name, no face, no pattern, just a growing trail of compromised operations, vanished agents, and impossible American foresight. Every effort to detect him had failed. Every theory had pointed the wrong direction, and the damage it was no longer just strategic. It was existential. By early 1981, NATO force deployments began responding to Warsaw Pact movements in real time. Not days later, not through recon flights, but as they happened. Soviet tank exercises in Czechoslovakia were mirrored by NATO air drills over Germany. Submarine patrols near the Barents Sea were shadowed within hours. American diplomats arrived at arms talks with satellite imagery of Soviet missile train routes, imagery too new to have come from orbit. KGB leaders, backed into a corner, began quietly purging mid-level officers in signals and logistics departments. 4 were sent to internal exile. 2 disappeared altogether. But TRIDENT remained untouched because he wasn't in signals, he wasn't in logistics, he was in planning. And the one blind spot no one dared interrogate was themselves. The turning point came during Operation Stonewall, a multi-tiered KGB effort to rotate cipher systems across all 15 republics. It was designed to finally outmaneuver whatever electronic surveillance the Americans were allegedly deploying. The protocols were written by hand, copied by select officers, distributed via secure couriers, and within 10 days, the new cipher was cracked. The CIA, using TRIDENT's copies of the cipher distribution chart and the original phrase, keybook, had built a decryption matrix before the Soviets finished training their own agents on it. The result was a wave of intelligence intercepts that revealed Soviet strategic transport orders, agent movements in the Middle East, and supply chain gaps across the Eastern Bloc. Worse, the Americans began responding tactically, altering their deployments in ways that forced the Soviets to shift resources, reassign operatives, and question their own models. TRIDENT had not just exposed secrets, he had reshaped policy. And still, the KGB refused to see it, to acknowledge that one of their own trained in the system, loyal to the party, sworn to secrecy could do this, meant dismantling the myth that their shield was unbreakable. So instead, they broke themselves. Files disappeared from archives. A general in Leningrad committed suicide. An internal memo urged departments to suspend assumptions of loyalty in officer vetting. Trust became poison. Teams turned inward. The machine so dependent on hierarchy and discipline began to seize. The CIA, for its part, tightened the net. TRIDENT's handlers were rotated. Messages shifted to ultra-low frequency bursts. Drops became sparser, more surgical. But the volume of intelligence never slowed, because TRIDENT didn't want to escape. He wanted to stay, to keep bleeding the bear. And the longer he remained undetected, the deeper the wound became. To the Soviets, the CIA had always been a chaotic, fragmented force, brash, impulsive, too reliant on technology and not nearly as disciplined as the KGB. Moscow saw American intelligence as reactive, not strategic. It was a comforting illusion. But they were wrong. Beneath the surface of that seemingly disorganized apparatus was a system engineered for resilience, agility, and long-term penetration. The CIA's Directorate of Operations, particularly the Soviet division, had spent decades learning one critical truth in order to dismantle a closed empire. You don't need 1,000 agents. You just need one. And so, the CIA didn't flood Moscow with spies. They didn't launch risky operations on Soviet soil. They built something else, a low-signature, compartmentalized framework designed to protect a single point of failure, TRIDENT. His recruitment had been no accident. Years earlier, long before the leaks began, a small team within the CIA's Counterintelligence Center had flagged inconsistencies in Soviet political doctrine, men trained in Marxist theory, but quietly critical of its execution. Officers who had watched Brezhnev's stagnant rule breed resentment inside the very system meant to enforce loyalty. One of those men had been identified, approached, cultivated, not with promises of escape, not with threats, but with purpose. TRIDENT hadn't been bought. He'd been convinced, and once the channel was open, the CIA didn't exploit it recklessly. They did the opposite. They shielded it like the crown jewel of American espionage. No paper trails, no electronic files. Only 3 case officers ever knew TRIDENT's true identity, and they never met in the same room. Drops were arranged using timeless tradecraft chalk marks, newspaper cues, hollowed-out bolts on train station benches. Information was moved with surgical precision. Every document TRIDENT passed was vetted, duplicated, and redistributed across departments without revealing the source. Langley built an entire operational membrane around him. Each file he transmitted was analyzed not just for content, but for pattern disruption, ensuring that the Soviets would never suspect one man. And when leaks caused Soviet collapses, when agents vanished, when facilities were compromised, the CIA made sure to seed false narratives, radio intercepts, satellite discoveries, even fabricated bribes. Every move was layered with misdirection. And yet, it wasn't just the CIA that made TRIDENT effective. It was America's system of skepticism. Unlike the rigid, top-down control of Soviet intelligence, American agencies embraced compartmentalized doubt. Analysts questioned reports. Operatives second-guessed strategies. Field officers were trained to look for flaws in themselves, in sources, in systems. This wasn't seen as disloyalty. It was doctrine. So when TRIDENT handed over a Soviet general's travel log, the CIA didn't act immediately. They waited, verified, cross-checked. Only when independent signals confirmed the report did they respond. This discipline, so unlike the paranoia gripping Moscow, allowed the Americans to avoid exposing their asset. And it worked. For years, through war scares, arms summits, and espionage crackdowns, TRIDENT kept feeding them Soviet truths, and America, in return, built decisions not on guesswork but on certainty. The true American system wasn't just a network of spies. It was a machine designed to guard the value of one man's truth, a truth powerful enough to bring a superpower to its knees without firing a shot. By 1982, the Soviets weren't just being outmaneuvered, they were being humiliated. Across Europe, Soviet-backed operations collapsed one after another. Arms shipments routed through Bulgaria vanished en route to African proxies. Undercover operatives in Vienna were arrested within hours of meeting their handlers. A KGB technical surveillance unit stationed in Helsinki returned to Moscow in disgrace after discovering that its bugs had been neutralized before they were ever activated. But these weren't coincidences. They were orchestrated defeats, precision strikes by an intelligence machine that knew exactly where to press. And each failure told a louder story. Someone was feeding the enemy, and the KGB couldn't stop it. Inside Moscow center, the whispers became roars. Senior officers began interrogating subordinates without clearance. Entire floors of the headquarters were sealed. Dozens of agents were reassigned to menial posts across the Union, and in at least 3 cases, the suspicion fell on innocent men arrested, coerced, discarded. None of them were TRIDENT. The real source remained hidden, still showing up for work, still copying documents, still feeding the machine that was grinding the Soviet intelligence apparatus into dust. In Langley, the CIA's Soviet division couldn't believe their luck. One case officer, reviewing a drop containing the KGB's revised foreign asset roster, simply muttered, "This is treason in slow motion," and it was accelerating. The final blow came during a joint Soviet-Cuban operation designed to intercept American submarine signals in the South Atlantic. It had been planned in absolute secrecy, codenamed Typhoon, with operational details restricted to a handful of senior officers across 2 continents. The CIA had the full plan before the Soviets finished typing it. They rerouted U.S. assets, set traps along the Cuban coast, and intercepted the mission before it even began. The Soviets never stood a chance. But the real damage was internal, because when the operation failed, when Soviet command demanded answers, there were none. No leaks, no intercepted messages, no double agents exposed, just silence. TRIDENT had struck again. And for the first time, even the Kremlin's most senior officers began to say what no one had dared before. There is a mole. He is one of us, and we cannot find him. The humiliation was no longer covert. It was strategic. The CIA wasn't just winning battles, it was reshaping the battlefield itself. American policymakers, briefed by the National Security Council using TRIDENT's insights, made bolder moves. They walked into arms talks knowing what their Soviet counterparts feared most. They predicted troop shifts, anticipated economic bottlenecks, dismantled proxy alliances before they solidified, and every time the Soviets tried to strike back, they found themselves shadowboxing a ghost. One man, invisible in a sea of uniforms, had turned their monolith into glass. The KGB had built a machine of loyalty, surveillance, and fear. But TRIDENT had proven one terrifying truth: information beats ideology, and silence, when placed correctly, can be louder than any bomb. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of tanks or missiles. It fell because it could no longer trust its own shadow. By 1983, the impact of TRIDENT's betrayal had gone beyond the battlefield. It reached the heart of the Kremlin's confidence, cracking the very ideology that held the superstate together. The Soviets had built their system on certainty that the West was always the enemy, that the party always knew best, and that their control over information was absolute. TRIDENT shattered all of that. In late 1982, Politburo members received an intelligence briefing suggesting that NATO war exercises in West Germany were a cover for a potential first strike. This was classic Soviet paranoia, but what followed was not. For the first time, the inner circle hesitated. They no longer trusted their own analysts, their own signals, their own generals, because every time they reacted, the Americans were already waiting. The Reforger war games weren't a cover, they were a performance, staged for Soviet satellites that had been lured into a trap. The CIA, using TRIDENT's exact knowledge of Soviet satellite flight paths, had orchestrated the entire exercise to expose just how predictable the USSR's surveillance doctrine had become. Moscow watched, helpless, as its own blind spots were exploited by enemies who seemed to know more about the Soviet war machine than the Soviets themselves. The ideological collapse had begun. Within the KGB, a series of internal reviews known as the Gromko hearings tried to reconstruct where the breach had occurred. Hundreds of transcripts were analyzed, dozens of career officers were purged, but every path led to dead ends or worse, to men too senior to question. Eventually, the conclusion was clear. The breach wasn't in signals, or codebooks, or operations. It was in faith. Faith in the system. Faith in security. Faith in loyalty. TRIDENT had proven that the most dangerous enemy was not outside the walls but inside, seated quietly in a room, listening, recording, and deciding, moment by moment, to destroy everything he'd once sworn to protect. And by 1984, the effects rippled across the entire Soviet bloc. Warsaw Pact allies grew suspicious of Moscow's ability to protect joint assets. Proxy regimes in the Middle East began doubting the Soviet commitment to secrecy. Arms deals slowed, intelligence exchanges halted. The illusion of control, the very fabric of Soviet power, began to unravel. Meanwhile, the CIA pulled back. The volume of intelligence slowed. TRIDENT had done enough. He faded into silence, not because he was discovered, but because the mission had changed. The information war had already been won. He had hollowed out the empire, from within, quietly, irreversibly. Today, his name is known only to a few. His file, if it exists, is locked in a windowless room beneath Langley, sealed behind layers of clearance, no medals, no parades, no face on a monument, but his ghost is everywhere. TRIDENT, whatever his true identity, reshaped the final decade of the Cold War. Not with bombs, not with bullets, but with silence, paper, and a conviction that truth could puncture even the most impenetrable walls. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged the breach. Even after its collapse in 1991, no public reckoning occurred. The archives released to historians sanitized and partial mention surveillance losses, procedural failures, cryptographic weaknesses, but never betrayal, never him. And yet, the fingerprints remain. Declassified U.S. briefings now show that the Reagan administration made some of its boldest decisions not from speculation, but from certainty. Certainty rooted in the documents TRIDENT provided. The man who exposed Soviet weaknesses made peace talks possible. He gave American diplomats leverage without needing force, and he showed that, in the right hands, a single pen could be more dangerous than 1,000 tanks. He never defected, never fled. He simply stopped. Perhaps he retired. Perhaps he died in silence. Perhaps he still walks past the plaques at KGB headquarters, now housing a new Russian agency, wondering if anyone ever guessed the truth. But if he's still out there somewhere in the shadows of post-Soviet memory, he would know one thing. He was the ghost who broke the bear. And his war ended not with fanfare, but with quiet victory. Because the Cold War wasn't just fought in skies and seas. It was fought in the hearts of men who chose what to believe, and TRIDENT made them doubt everything.